Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. And today we're going to be looking at this editorial in the Global Times. It kind of paints a picture of what China's diplomatic landscape might look like in 2025. And I think it's particularly intriguing timing, considering we're looking at some pretty significant anniversaries, right? 80 years since the end of World War II, right? 80 years since the founding of the UN, 50 years of China-EU relations. And to top it all off, China's going to be chairing the Shanghai Cooperation Organization this year.
Yeah, you're absolutely right to highlight the timing. I think that having all of these events happening in the same year really does create a unique backdrop for trying to understand how China is going to be conducting its diplomacy.
But they're not wasting any time, it seems. Right out of the gate, we saw this whirlwind of diplomatic activity. Virtual meetings, phone calls, messages, in-person visits with leaders from all over the place. I mean,
Ah,
Russia, the U.S., the EU, Vietnam, Sri Lanka.
hmm.
It's pretty impressive, the breadth of their engagement.
Yeah, it's a really great example of what the Global Times calls China's comprehensive, multi-level, multifaceted approach to diplomacy.
I was going to ask you about that phrase. What does that actually mean for, someone like me who's trying to understand what China's doing on the world stage?
Sure, yeah. I mean, essentially, it means that they're not limiting themselves to just one group or block of nations. They're engaging with a really wide spectrum of countries, from superpowers to their neighbors to members of BRICS, and even what's often called the Global South.
Okay, so that phrase keeps popping up, the global south.
Yeah.
Can we break that down a little bit? What exactly are we talking about when we say that?
Yeah, so the Global South is basically a term that we use to describe nations in Latin America, Africa, Asia, Oceania, that are typically classified as developing or emerging economies. So it's a way of acknowledging this kind of shared set of challenges and perspectives that these countries face, many of which feel that their voices aren't really heard in sort of the traditional forms of global power.
So it sounds like China's actively reaching out to those nations. But even beyond that, with so many different players on the board, the geopolitical landscape must be incredibly complex right now.
Yeah, absolutely. The Global Times itself even acknowledges what it calls the turbulence and interweaving complexities that we're all facing. They talk about peace deficits, development deficits, security deficits, and then just the rising geopolitical tensions.
Yeah, so it paints a pretty stark picture of where we're at globally. But how does China's approach to diplomacy fit into all of this? I noticed that the editorial uses this kind of interesting phrase. They talk about China offering a clear stream in this turbulent environment.
Yeah, that's a pretty powerful metaphor. I think they're essentially arguing that their focus on things like peaceful development and win-win cooperation, as opposed to confrontation, that this provides a kind of stabilizing force in a world that feels increasingly uncertain.
Okay, but is that realistic? How does this play out in practice?
Well, they highlight a couple things. First of all, their commitment to maintaining stable relations with major powers, like the US and Russia. At the same time, they're really focused on building a peaceful and prosperous Asian community with all of their neighbors.
So basically playing nice with the big guys while also fostering regional stability. It's a delicate balancing act.
Yeah, for sure. And then on top of that, you've got their focus on engaging with the global south that we were talking about, and something that they call people-to-people diplomacy, which is about building relationships beyond just government-to-government interaction.
So think about things like cultural exchanges, educational programs,
Yeah.
tourism, that kind of stuff.
Exactly.
So fostering understanding and goodwill at a more personal level. But, there's always a certain degree of skepticism, I think, when we hear this kind of rhetoric coming from any country. How does China's track record stack up against what they're saying?
That's a fair question, and it's something that we're going to be delving into a lot more deeply as we kind of continue this deep dive. But one thing that the editorial is very clear about is that China wants to be seen as a responsible major power with international influence, innovative leadership, and strong moral appeal.
Those are some pretty hefty aspirations. But it sounds like they're not just content with sitting on the sidelines. They really want to shape the conversation globally.
Exactly. And to understand how they're doing that, I think we need to look beyond just their bilateral relationships. The Global Times specifically highlights this idea of shared global responsibility, particularly amongst those major powers that we were talking about.
So not just acting alone, but really encouraging others to step up and contribute to global stability as well.
That's exactly right. So, for example, there's strategic interaction with the U.S. It's not just about resolving issues between the two countries. It's about working together to try and create a more stable world. And it's the same idea with their growing ties with Europe and Russia. It's about leveraging those relationships to hopefully create a more predictable and cooperative global environment.
So it sounds like they're taking a very proactive approach.
Hmm.
But how are they actually going about implementing these goals?
Well, the editorial points to things like China's increasing engagement with all these different international platforms,
Hmm.
like the UN, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, BRICS, the G20. Basically, these are all venues where they can try to promote cooperation and participate in shaping global governance.
So using those existing structures to advocate for their vision of what they often call a shared future for mankind.
Yes. And it's important to note that this message is coming straight from the top. In his New Year message, President Xi stressed the importance of things like rising above conflict, caring for humanity, and trying to build a shared future through things like friendship, cooperation, and cultural exchange. So it's a pretty powerful call to action, I think, not just for China, but for the whole world.
A lot to unpack there. I think so far we've gotten a pretty good glimpse into what China's diplomatic ambitions are and the kind of global context in which they're operating. But I guess the question is, are these aspirations truly achievable? Or are they just wishful thinking?
That is the million-dollar question. And it's definitely one that we're going to keep exploring as we kind of delve deeper into this fascinating editorial. It's interesting, right? We often get so caught up in those daily headlines that it's helpful to step back and kind of analyze something like China's diplomatic strategy. And you start to see this really fascinating long game at play.
Totally. And the Global Times makes it very clear that this isn't just talk. They specifically mention how China's deepened ties with Europe and Russia are directly contributing to global strategic stability.
And that's so important right now, right? In a world that often feels like it's teetering on the edge of chaos, having these strong and stable relationships, it's almost like these anchors,
Hmm.
that create this foundation for cooperation and predictability on a global scale.
Right. It's like they're trying to build this network of trust and mutual understanding to counterbalance all those forces that are pulling everyone apart. And then we have those international organizations that we keep mentioning, the UN, the BRICS G20, the editorial highlights, how China's really stepping up in all of them, not just as a member, but really as a force that's trying to shape the agenda.
Exactly, and they're pushing for solutions that benefit a wider range of countries, not just those select few. It's a far cry from that old school might makes right approach to diplomacy that we've seen from other major powers in the past. China seems to be advocating for something much more nuanced,
Right.
a real consensus building style.
Which is definitely refreshing to see. But what do you think is driving this shift? Why is China embracing this approach now?
That's a great question. I think it's probably a combination of factors. First,
Yeah.
China's economic growth and development has undeniably given them a much more prominent seat at the table. They've got the clout now to really be a major player on the world stage, and they're using it.
So they're not just reacting to global events anymore, they're actively shaping them.
Exactly. And secondly, I think there's a genuine belief within China's leadership that cooperation is actually the best path forward for everybody. They've seen the benefits of working together firsthand, and they're trying to promote that model globally. It's almost like they're saying, look, this approach has worked for us, and we think it can work for others too.
There's a certain pragmatism to that.
Absolutely. China understands that in our interconnected world, problems in one region are inevitably going to impact everyone else. So promoting stability and cooperation isn't just some altruistic ideal. It's also a matter of self-preservation.
It's in their own best interest to create a more stable and predictable world.
Exactly. And then finally, I think we can't discount the influence of Chinese philosophy and cultural values,
Yeah.
which really emphasize harmony and balance. Those ideas are definitely reflected in their diplomatic approach. It's not just about winning, it's about finding solutions that work for everyone involved.
Trying to create a win-win scenario whenever possible.
Right.
But of course, no country agrees with everyone all the time. There are always going to be disagreements and differences of opinion.
Of course. But the editorial suggests that China is at least willing to engage in dialogue, to listen to other perspectives, and to try to find that common ground whenever possible.
Which in itself is a positive sign. It's just a willingness to work within that existing international system and be what we might call a responsible global citizen.
Right. But the editorial also stresses the need for shared global responsibility, particularly among those major powers. It's not enough for China to just talk the talk they need to demonstrate a willingness to actually share the burden of global leadership and work alongside other countries to address these common challenges.
Actions speak louder than words.
Exactly. And this brings us to another really interesting aspect that's highlighted in the editorial China's relationship with what they call the global south.
We touched on that earlier, but I think it warrants further exploration. What exactly does that mean in this context?
So essentially, it refers to countries in Latin America, Africa, Asia, and Oceania that are often overlooked or marginalized in global affairs. These nations face a lot of unique challenges, things like poverty, climate change, political instability, and China sees itself as kind of a natural partner for them.
So they're positioning themselves as a champion of the developing world, a country that understands their challenges firsthand and is committed to helping them overcome them.
Exactly. And this manifests in a lot of different ways. We're seeing significant investments in infrastructure projects, things like roads, railways, ports. China is also providing development assistance, helping to build schools, hospitals, other essential services.
It's almost like a modern-day Marshall Plan, but with a distinctly Chinese flavor.
That's a good analogy, but it goes beyond just economic assistance. China is also increasing its diplomatic presence in these countries. They're opening embassies and consulates, sending diplomats to engage directly with local governments and communities.
So they're really focused on building relationships, not just throwing money at the problem. Yeah.
Precisely. And this is where that people-to-people diplomacy that we were talking about earlier really comes into play. China's promoting cultural exchanges, sending students and scholars abroad, and inviting people from other countries to visit China.
So it's all about building those bridges, fostering understanding, and creating a sense of shared purpose.
Exactly. And this aspect of China's diplomatic approach has the potential to be truly transformative. It's not just governments talking to governments anymore. It's about people connecting with people, building relationships at all levels of society, creating a web of interconnectedness that transcends national boundaries.
It's a compelling vision, but is it realistic?
That's a question we'll explore further as we continue our deep dive. But one thing is clear. China's diplomatic maneuvers are reshaping the global landscape in profound ways.
Yeah, it's fascinating to see how China's really kind of weaving together all these different strands, economics, diplomacy, culture, into this cohesive strategy. It's not just about projecting power in that traditional sense. It feels like they're really cultivating influence and trying to shape global perceptions.
It's a textbook example of what's often called soft power, right? That ability to persuade and attract rather than coerce. And all of these investments in things like development, cultural exchanges, and people-to-people diplomacy that we were just talking about, they're all part of that.
So it's like they're trying to change the narrative about China, right? Moving away from that image of just an economic powerhouse or a potential military threat to something more like a benevolent force, a reliable partner on the world stage.
Exactly. And the editorial seems to suggest that it's working. They point to a growing number of countries that are really starting to embrace China's vision of this shared future for mankind.
But surely no strategy is without its challenges. What kind of potential roadblocks or pitfalls do you see for China's diplomatic ambitions?
Well, one challenge is going to be managing expectations, right? China's rise has been so rapid that some countries might expect them to take on a more dominant role in global affairs than they're actually comfortable with.
Right. It's a tough balancing act. They want to be seen as a leader, but they don't want to overstep their bounds or alienate potential partners.
For sure. Another challenge is overcoming that inherent suspicion that often comes with being a rising power. Some countries might view China's motives with a certain amount of skepticism, see their actions as a threat rather than an opportunity.
It's like that old saying, right? The nail that sticks out gets hammered down. Success often breeds resentment, especially on the global stage.
Absolutely. And then we can't forget about the impact of domestic politics. China's got its own internal challenges to deal with, things like economic inequality and environmental concerns, and those could easily undermine their diplomatic efforts if they're not addressed effectively.
It's a good reminder that foreign policy never operates in a vacuum.
Yeah.
Those domestic issues can cast a pretty long shadow.
Oh, for sure. And then finally, there's just the inherent challenge of navigating this incredibly complex and ever-changing global landscape, right? We're facing so many issues right now. Climate change, pandemics, this rapid technological advancement. It's a lot for any country to handle, even one with China's resources and ambition.
So while the Global Times is presenting a pretty positive outlook on China's diplomatic approach, it's not necessarily a guaranteed success. It sounds like there are going to be quite a few hurdles to overcome, and it's going to require some very careful and skillful maneuvering to navigate all the complexities that lie ahead.
Definitely.
Well, it brings us back to our starting point, I think.
Yeah.
Understanding China's diplomatic strategies is absolutely essential for anyone who's trying to make sense of the world that we live in today. It's a story that's still unfolding, but the stakes are incredibly high.
And I think that's the key takeaway from this deep dive, right? China's actions on the world stage are going to have a profound impact on all of us, whether we realize it or not. So stay informed, pay attention to the nuances, and don't be afraid to ask those tough questions.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And on that note, I think we're going to wrap up our deep dive into China's diplomatic landscape. Hopefully you found it insightful and thought-provoking.
Yeah, before we go, we'd love to hear your thoughts. How do you think China's diplomatic philosophy is going to impact these global issues that we've been talking about in the coming years? Share your insights in the comments below.
And as always, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tell your friends about the deep dive. We'll see you next time for another fascinating exploration of the ideas that are shaping our world.